Good morning. I think it is slowly approaching 9 o'clock and we will be starting our presentation. I will just do some short housekeeping rules. I'll kindly suggest everyone to stay muted during the presentation. We will be having a Q&A at the end of the session, so any questions that you might have, please either keep them to the end where you will have the opportunity to unmute yourself or write them in the chat, and then Michelle has kindly agreed to read them out loud during the Q&A session. And I shall also say that we are trying to record this meeting, so please be aware of this. We hope we will be successful, and if so, we will be circulating the video afterwards, along with the slides used in all the presentations. So that's all from my side, and I will just give the floor to Jesper. He will begin his presentation, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much, Emilie, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining this morning. My name is Jesper Knudsen, and I am Energy Counselor at the Danish Embassy in Seoul. I shall just briefly share my screen with you. I think you should be able to see something now. So, first of all, again, a warm welcome from us here at the Embassy in Seoul. Together with the Danish Energy Agency, we have been making a, here we go. We have commissioned COWI and Jumbo to make a report for us and a study report on risk and tender comparison for offshore wind with a special focus on Korea. So in Korea, there is a lot of things happening at the moment on build out of renewable energy. And there's a lot of questions from both authorities and industry on the risk and the risk management of offshore wind, and also benchmarking on other countries' tender process. So this is what this report is supposed to cover, and it will be used in the future for our work here, especially at the Embassy and the Danish Energy Agency, for further work with our Korean partners out here. I will just give you a very brief fly-in into the energy landscape in Korea, and I will also give the word to the Danish Energy Agency afterwards. But first, I'd just like to give you all some context on Korea. You may know this already, but some of you may not, so therefore just a little bit of fly into this. As you can see on this graph here from IEWFA, renewable energy in Korea is not really that big, to be honest, if you compare to OECD countries. Around 10% of the electricity production in Korea comes from renewables. That is mostly solar, some hydro, and also some biomass, and wind, both offshore and onshore, comprises only less than 1% of this whole picture here. Nuclear, coal, and gas, thermal power plants are still the main contributor to the electricity in the power mix in Korea. That, of course, has to change. There's also a climate crisis on the agenda in Korea. There's new NDC targets. So therefore, coal and gas must be phased out over the coming years. Nuclear will still be big in Korea, as it already is, but coal and gas needs to be phased out. And here, of course, offshore wind is essential to that. So in Korea, there are certain sites around the peninsula where you can harvest wind to make a good business case for offshore wind. They are indicated here. So at the Incheon area, which is basically up around Seoul, you have there's planned some farms out of the coast of Incheon, but the majority is really down in the southwest corner of the country, with the area all around Sinan province, and also Ulsan to the east coast. But here we are talking more about floating offshore wind. Luckily, at the southwest area of Korea, there is shallow water, so it's most fixed bottom. But at the Ulsan area, you have also better wind to harvest, but it will be a floating offshore wind. The current power production situation is a little bit like this in Korea. The thermal power plants are situated around the supply, around the consumption area. So around Seoul and Gyeonggi province, there is a lot of industry. That's the big city of Seoul, of course. So here you also have a lot of, especially coal-fired power plants. And you also have some at the south, where you also have some heavy industries that consumes a lot of electricity. But if you compare these two pictures, you can almost see there's a discrepancy. So the offshore wind power production will be situated relatively far away from the consumption areas. So this of course puts some challenges to the grids and grid expansion and how you transport the energy from the production sites to the consumption areas. So that is a big issue also in Korea, as it is in so many other countries. So Korea, in general, is facing multiple challenges in transforming to a sustainable and resilient energy system. Coal is to be phased out by 2040, which means that something must happen, and it means that you need to accelerate the offshore wind deployment. And to that end, you have a few challenges. I would say it's not only in Korea. Everybody else also faces challenges, but in Korea maybe more so because offshore wind is a relatively new way of producing electricity. So there's a lot of legislation challenges. There is luckily a new offshore wind act being passed that will control the tender process more in a way that is done in Denmark and Europe, going from an open door concept to a more government control process. Then there's questions on localization, developing a local supply chain, local acceptance. Here we're talking fishery associations and so on. So there's a few things that are, you could say, challenging the whole process going forward. Luckily, in Korea, there are some good political signals, so things are moving, are progressing forward. Grid expansion and grid development to accommodate all the new renewable energy coming in is, of course, also a big issue. And then in a more broader context, energy efficiency and sector integration, how do you then spend and use the green energy coming into the system is also something coming higher up on the agenda in Korea. So this was really just a very, very brief fly into the situation in Korea. And from this, I would like to hand over to Jakob from the Danish Energy Agency, who will tell a little bit about the cooperation that we have between Korea and Denmark on the energy agenda.
Thank you, Jesper, very much. Yes, just quickly on why we are here. The Danish Energy Agency, we are part of the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. We are part of a larger family that also includes our TSO, the Energy Net, which has also been very active and collaborating in Korea. And we have data and research agencies such as Danish Geodata and GEOS. We, in the Danish Energy Agency, we have a dual role. We are both a regulator, but we are also a facilitator. And that means that we are looking on ensuring green, secure, and cost-effective energy systems. And this means we both have to balance our ambitious climate targets with security of supply and affordable energy prices. Please change the slide. I'm sorry. This is just to... Good, we have those there. We do this in practice actually by ensuring through regulation, we make analysis. We are actually also ensuring the subsidies, and we are also managing part of the energy system ourselves, including offshore wind tenders and permitting. In there, we coordinate permits, we run tenders, and we align stakeholders. And that means definitely very much part of our work is also our dialogue with the private partners, the developers in energy agency. Perhaps you could change it. Good. We are part of a large structure. I am from the global cooperation, and we have a lot of national departments which are actually tasked to executing our responsibilities. Our energy governance partnership program, EGP, is our key platform for international cooperation in OECD countries. We also have collaboration in developing countries, but that's outside our EGP collaboration. That's why we are also collaborating with Korea. Through this program, we engage directly with our partner governments to share practical experiences on frameworks, and we are planning and ensuring collaboration on the market design. This allows us to transfer concrete lessons on how to reduce risk and enabling large-scale deployment of renewable energy, including offshore wind, as what we are speaking about today. And slide 3. Yes, why are we doing this? And our rationale is that we are a small country. We represent only 0.07% of the world's population, and we are around 0.1 of the global CO2 emissions. I'm responsible for that. So through our global collaboration, which today includes about 21 partner countries, we engage with market which are representing about 61% of the world's population and 70% of the global emissions. So our impact lies in sharing what works. This is embedded actually in our Climate Act. Denmark should act as a pioneer, and we are assisting in helping driving the global green transition through this. And our offshore wind is a strong example of this. And that's why it's not only about electricity, it's also to drive the industrial development, create job, and enable our new sectors such as Power-to-X and energy storage. That was quickly about us, and we are looking forward for today's presentation. And back to you, Jesper.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And I will quickly and swiftly pass it over to COWI, who will dive a little bit deeper into the details. I think it's Valeria, maybe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Jesper and Jakob. I will share my screen. Just give me a sec. Let me know when you can see it. Right, so perfect. Thank you. All right, so good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again. My name is Valeria Fussinga. I am a Policy and Regulatory Director in COWI's Energy Department, and I'm very glad to be presenting the results of this study to you today. So before we dive in, I just want to flag one thing up front. This report was finalized in November 2025, and as you know, Korea's offshore wind sector moves very fast. So in the months since we submitted the final version, quite a bit has happened, and some of the things I'm also going to touch upon in this presentation. So the Offshore Wind Special Act is coming into force today, and Ministry of Climate, Energy and Environment is now fully operational. And importantly, we're already seeing active steps towards implementing several of the recommendations that we had from this study. So I really would encourage you all to see the findings in that context, so as a snapshot of what the market looked like at that point in time, but also in a way as an analysis that is already being validated and taken forward in practice. So let's get started. Here's a quick overview of how my presentation is structured, and so you know what to expect. We'll begin with some background and introduction, so basically setting the scene on Korea's offshore wind ambitions and why sort of this study was commissioned. And then I'll move on to the core risk analysis, which is what I'll be presenting across the next slides. After that, my colleague from Jumbo, Yang, will take over for the tender comparison section, looking at how basically different international markets structure their own offshore wind tenders. And then I will come back in the end for the recommendations before we open it up for Q&A in the end. I should also encourage you all to write your questions in the chat or keep them in the end for the Q&A session. So let's go to the first section. So let me start a bit with the sort of the why behind this study. As you already heard from the previous presentations, Korea has set actually some quite ambitious goals and targets, some of the most ambitious in Asia, 14.3 gigawatt offshore wind by 2030 and 40.7 by 2038. And yet we can see there is a gap because as of last year, we had only around 250 megawatt of installed capacity. And that gap between sort of ambition and reality is really the starting point of this study, which, as mentioned already, was commissioned by the Danish Embassy in Korea and the Danish Energy Agency. So the goal of this study has been to sort of support South Korea in managing risks across the full offshore wind project life cycle while drawing on the sort of international best practices and experiences to really improve and strengthen the tender design. Specifically for Denmark, where I'm based, Denmark has plus 35 years of experience in offshore wind, so we really can understand, what works and what doesn't, and that experience can really be brought, to deliver some insights in also what is relevant for Korean policymakers. The study was delivered jointly by COWI and by Jumbo Consulting Group and is structured around the three tasks that you see on the right. So first, comprehensive risk analysis, which is what I'm going to touch upon in a few moments. Secondly, the comparative tender study across APAC and European countries. And third, sort of a set of conclusions and recommendations. So putting South Korea's context a little bit more into perspective, as mentioned before, so right now over 77% of the energy mix, basically not only electricity, but also generally energy depends on fossil fuels in Korea. And offshore wind has really been identified as a key component, in South Korea's journey towards carbon neutrality. So what is holding things back? This slide tries to capture a bit the barriers that we have identified in our analysis. So first of all, you have the fragmented governance. So historically, we've seen multiple ministries, multiple agencies sharing responsibilities across policy, permitting, implementation. And this actually has already been partially addressed by the recent establishment of the Ministry of Climate, Energy and Environment, the MCE, which has absorbed most of energy and climate functions. But of course, there is still some coordination going on. The second is sort of permitting bottlenecks. We can see approval process in Korea has been multi-step, sequential, quite unpredictable, and with developers having to navigate plus 20 individual permits, also with some unclear timelines, no single authority coordinating it. And that, of course, increases uncertainty and risks. And the third is the grid uncertainty. So kept cooperating as the sole grid operator, grid expansion has been much more reactive rather than sort of anticipatory as kind of proper planning, and that means that sort of projects can also face delays and simply because the transmission infrastructure isn't ready for them. The government's also here signed a shift. We've seen the Special Act on Grid Expansion, so the National Power Grid Act being enforced. There are plans also for a dedicated offshore U-shaped grid. But again, still there is some clarity needed on cost sharing and timing, which is evolving. On a more positive note, again, we've seen the most significant development is the Offshore Wind Special Act, promulgated in March 2025, entering into force today, which really kind of changes this landscape and introducing government-led zoning, central permitting committee, and really also aiming to reduce these multiple permits and then generally the timing for the development of offshore wind projects. So now let me take you through the risk analysis. And I think just before we dive into the risks themselves, I will just briefly explain the methodology behind it, because it kind of shapes also how you should read the next slides. So the purpose of risk mapping is to identify and assess uncertainties that can affect cost, schedule, overall project viability in offshore wind development. And of course, this is absolutely pivotal from a developer's perspective, because and in this mapping of risks has to really happen at the early stage, because it can really inform also the way contracts are structured, project viability overall, and schedule, and sort of getting the full overview of what the project is going to look like. And of course, an important backdrop to this analysis here is the macroeconomic context. So we've seen that between 2022 and up to last year, 2025, in the global offshore wind capital expenditure, they really increased. This has been, of course, different depending on the geography, but we see around 20 to 40% of increase, largely driven by inflation in materials driving EPC and logistic costs, higher interest rates. And these pressures, of course, again, are across the globe, but they also become, acute in Korea, since Korea is also South Korea has a quite large reliance on imported equipment, and exposure on also foreign exchange fluctuations. So we also taken, of course, that into consideration as sort of the main, the broader context. So what we did was structuring this analysis across 6 project life cycles. So early development, concept selection, project maturation, execution planning, construction and commissioning, and finally O&M, so operation and maintenance. And we have identified risk across 6 categories: regulatory and permitting, financial, technical and design, supply chain and logistics, environmental, and finally stakeholder and community. For each of these risks, then we assigned a likelihood score, so basically going from unlikely to very likely, and an impact from 1 to 4 based on the potential cost and schedule impact. And then multiplying this will give us a risk score, then that we would use to sort of make a prioritization of risks. Then we also, of course, flagged Korea-specific risks throughout, so you can really see where are the sort of distinct vulnerabilities compared to other markets. So this table is important because it kind of shows, what we mean when we say critical, major, or use, terms like those, because that really depends sort of where you are in the project. So the main sort of key, you don't have to focus so much on all the numbers here, but the main sort of key, message from this slide is that the financial impact of, the delays, that really escalates dramatically as the project advances. So except for the final phase, for your O&M, especially when you go into execution and of course construction, commissioning, even small delays, they can be very, very costly, basically. So even though maybe risk could be manageable early on, they become suddenly existential, if they materialize later on. And this could be, for example, for permitting challenges, regulatory. Of course, whenever this happens, in early development, they are inconvenient, but they can still be somehow resolved without derailing the whole project. But of course, if some compliance issues, some regulatory issues arise later on, they can actually jeopardize the entire financial model of a project. So that's kind of the lens through which you should look at the next slides. So early development, that is the phase where risk likelihoods are highest. We look into 60 to 90% because project is still being shaped, regulatory environment is still being navigated. And here, of course, you have, first of all, the top 5, as you can see, are all permitting and regulatory or environmental risks. And 3 of them also are Korea-specific dimension. So the unclear permitting frameworks, that is again generally a global risk, but of course has also a sort of a dimension, a Korean dimension, because we've had this shift from the old developer-led open door system to this new government-led zoning framework, and that is still being implemented, and that of course creates some kind of transitional ambiguity that developers also need to budget and plan for in their projects. Then we have the regulatory fragmentation, again, is what I mentioned before, multi-ministry challenges, having these different authorities having to be involved. partially being mitigated now, at least with the establishment of the MCE. Coordination, of course, is still a work in progress. Then the length and complexity of permitting itself is also an issue. And in Korea, we've seen that with these sequential multi-gate approval processes where projects must pass through different sort of site selection, marine service, EIA, fisheries consultations, and so on. That is also being, partly mitigated by the one-stop shop committee. And then, of course, we have the fisheries conflict, which is not as such, Korea specific. We've seen those in other parts of the world, but it's quite intense in the Korean context because opposition from fishing communities has been also one of the dominant social risks, at least in the Korean offshore wind landscape, and also having causing delays to the projects. So the key mitigations at this stage, of course, as you can see, there are basically early dialogue and budget contingency for rescoping, and for Korea, of course, specifically close engagement really with this also incoming one-stop permitting committee as it becomes operational. Moving on to the concept selection, that is really the phase where sort of technical design begins to take shape, and also where regulatory requirements start to crystallize. Risk likelihoods overall remain moderate to high. The key challenge is that while maybe some uncertainties are narrowed, through design and site studies, new risks also emerge, specifically related to grid connection, to local government alignment, and also technology selection. Here, the two Korea-specific risks that are particularly important is the risk 2.2 here, so the ambiguity over offshore grid connection arrangements. That is basically the challenge of engaging with KEPCO to confirm grid capacity connection terms. Developers in Korea, have not really always been able to secure their electricity business license until KEPCO confirmed the sufficient grid capacity, and that's a bit of a chicken and egg problem that has also caused significant delays. So mitigation here, of course, is early engagement as early as possible with KEPCO and the authorities, and also working to clarify ownership and cost-sharing rules before they become a blocker. 2.3 is the other Korea-specific risk. That's the conflict between central and local government priorities. Of course, here, again, this is also quite broad on a global perspective. Central governments are more focused on national decarbonization targets, while local governments are more focused on maybe protecting regional economic interests. Could be jobs, fisheries, land use. And in Korea, of course, the local authorities are really sort of gatekeepers for social acceptance, which means that can also affect, of course, the timeline of a project, and also cause delays or even block projects. So here again, early and proactive engagement with local governments is key, and also implementation, also structure implementation, at least, of local benefit sharing frameworks, which are also planned actually under the Spatial Act. And then more on a technical side, we see here that suboptimal turbine foundation selection or underestimated wake effects, they could also, of course, be issues here that are more on a global scale. When we move into, so by the time we reach project maturation, the picture changes. You can see here we're starting to the impacts start to also rise, because that's also where maybe the technical uncertainties have more or less been resolved, but that's also really the phase where the project is public, it's known, it's out there. So that also means that it's known to, of course, communities, to media, environmental groups. And that's also where this kind of visibility drives a different kind of risk. So here we have, permits that can be delayed because of, maybe complexity or stricter condition, environmental monitoring and consultation will proceed, and then regulators could also add conditions and making projects maybe not compliant anyway, or especially, the legal challenges from NGOs or, the community opposition. That is something we've seen in different countries, definitely not only Korea specific. We've seen it in Denmark, in the UK, in Germany, but of course, again, it's starting also to be a feature of the more and more of the Korean landscape, specifically for the community opposition. That can cause, having, port blockades, vessel interference. There are things that happen. And of course, again, as mentioned before, possible mitigations here is early dialogue, structured benefit sharing funds, some more sort of proactive communication strategies. What makes also, I should say that what makes this phase particularly challenging is that many processes are converging simultaneously. So that's also the phase where permits are being finalized, reconnection is being negotiated, the financing is secured, there are closing supplier contracts. So any delay in, of course, one of those streams can really cascade across the full schedule. As we move into execution planning, the overall likelihood of risks drops, but the financial impact really starts to climb. So as little thing that has to go wrong before the project really gets jeopardized. And here again, we see, of course, the delay reaching FID. That's also flagged as a Korea-specific risk because FID requires all the things to be in place, permits, PPA or CFD, executed, EPC contract to be signed. So if any of those conditions slip, again, it can trigger a lot of chain effects. And also here we mentioned the trade restrictions affecting supply chain. That has also been quite, of course, important, especially in today's geopolitical dynamics. Korea's wind sector still remains dependent on imported turbine components, so external supply chain. And we've seen also that the government's localization criteria in the tender have added some complexity. So very important here to really diversify the supply chain base and and having also monitoring, of course, the trade policies proactively because things can really change from one day to another. Finally, we are almost finally on the construction and commissioning. That's where, the phase where really capital has been deployed, vessels are being mobilized, and again, any disruption carries also the highest financial consequences. As mentioned here, key risks can be inaccurate or delayed environmental reporting, defects in the components, breaches of permit construction, or even more like vessel breakdown and failure to properly bury cables. So here again, we can see, of course, that there can be also costly risks, more of a technical nature. And then finally, when we go into O&M phase, that is, of course, where the project, just because the project is built doesn't mean that risks disappear. There can still be issues related to technical issues like subsea cable failure, or often linked also to fishing activities, as it could be the case in Korea. Limited availability of specialist O&M vessels, that could also be, or increasing post-commissioning monitoring or insurance requirements. So that brings me actually to the end of this pretty quick overview of the risks. And what you've seen here is like a pattern, regulatory and permitting risks dominating in the early phases, technical supply chain risks intensifying through execution, and then operational risk not completely disappearing also when, of course, the project, the turbines are built. For Korea-specific vulnerabilities, we see in regulatory fragmentation, CAPCO grid constraints, fisheries opposition, and that's why also the Offshore Wind Special Act really is the most important lever available at the moment to address many of this. So it's important, of course, to have also quick and robust implementation of this. I will now hand over to my colleague Yang from Jumbo, who will walk you through the comparative tender study, and then I will come back to close with our recommendations in the end. So over to you, Yang.
Thanks. I hand over mic to me, Valeria. Then, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yang Bom Kang, the country managing director at Jumbo in Korea. And I am also very happy to participate in this webinar representing Jumbo. Then from now on, I would like to share what we have investigated as a part of this project, focus on the tender comparison. Next slide, please. Here we would like to present the analytical framework we used to compare the offshore wind tender system across the countries. We would like to say that tender design is not just a mechanism for price competition. It fundamentally shapes the level of risk the developers must carry, and also significantly influence over market confidence. We also categorize the risk into three types: regulatory, financial, and operational. First, for regulatory risk, is quite heavily affected by the permitting process, as you are fully aware of. Also for coordination among relevant authority and the level of pre-investigation information provided by the government. We also assessed how institutional setup, auction formats, guarantees and penalties, and local contents requirements could affect both project cost and uncertainties. This framework forms a basis for country-by-country comparison to be discussed in a bit more detail in the following slide. Please, next slide. Here we would like to provide high-level comparison of offshore wind tender system in the selected 5 countries: Denmark, UK, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. Each country's tender framework quite differ from each other, and these structural differences have major implications for project risk profiles and also for development timelines. For instance, Denmark and the UK really rely increasingly on centralized pre-investigation models that reduced early-stage uncertainty for developers. But by contrast, Korea and Taiwan still rely largely on developer-led surveys, which increase upfront cost exposure. Transmission responsibility also can vary. The UK's model transfer long-term transmission risk away from the developers, while Korea, Japan, and Taiwan place a greater share of this burden on the project owners. Here we should also highlight the supplementary explanation about the updates after these final deliverables. As Valeria pointed out, it's been quite a few months since last deliverable has been made, which include the Denmark CFD reform, which is closer to UK style, and the UK's allocation around 7 resort, which is the most successful auction released in early this year, with a 20-year CFD contract and 8.4 gigawatt awarded across the 12 projects. Also, we can also address the Japan matters. Japan's long-term decarbonization auction system, which is introduced for their round 2 and 3, which enable 20 years fixed capacity-based payments regardless of the actual generation. And also, we would like to address the Taiwan round 3.3 introduction, which included the introduction of the floor price and ESG scoring instead of the localization requirement to avoid any WTO-related disputes. And lastly but not least, we need to talk about Korea. Korea's RES auction system a little bit changes with an aim to boost the competitiveness by removing the rule that only 120 or 150 of the announced capacity could pass the first non-price evaluation, and also allowing unsuccessful project to enter into within the same year auction. Next slide, please. In this slide, we would like to summarize how various tender components influence the developer risk levels. Mechanism like UK CFD that significantly improve the bankability by providing predictable revenues, while uncapped or lowest bid auctions in Denmark and Japan can introduce substantial financial risk. And government-led pre-investigation packages also play a crucial role. In countries such as Denmark and UK and Japan, these packages reduce early-stage uncertainty for the developers and create a more competitive tender evaluation. But by the contrast, developer-led survey models in Korea and Taiwan could increase upfront cost and can lead to the delays. Transmission responsibility further differentiate risk exposure, especially in Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. Those countries require developers to build transmission assets by themselves, whereas the UK model externalizes such kind of risk. Strict deadline and heavy penalty deter investor from it's unrealistic the project, and proportionate scheme in UK and Korea's upcoming one-stop permitting can reduce the regulatory risk. Finally, local content requirement can either support or hinder project execution. excessively rigid rules, as we have seen in historically in Taiwan, tend to create bottlenecks, while past incentive-based framework help balance industrial policy without project feasibility. Let's move on the final slide. Lastly, here we would like to summarize the key success factors and also challenges we have identified overperforming this task for Korean offshore wind tendering framework. Above all, regulatory predictability is quite essential. The Offshore Wind Special Act, which enhances clarity by introducing government-led zoning and one-stop permitting structure, which we believe enable developers to progress with greater confidence. Grid readiness is another critical enabler. But we are already seeing now, KECO is developing their plan for transmission capacity reinforcement proactively to ensure that generated offshore wind power can be fully delivered into the national grid. And also for local contents, such local contents policy also requires some careful calibration. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the phased and the flexible approach can support supply chain development while maintaining investor confidence. Finally, we also need to talk about the financial predictability, including revenue stability. Should be the vital for attracting international development. And finally, we'd like to highlight that if Korea can strengthen this kind of elements, it has a huge potential to become one of the most competitive offshore wind market. Thanks for hearing my presentation, and I'm handing over mic back to the Valeria.
Thank you, Yang. All right, so I'm going to close out today's session here with our recommendations and build on everything you have heard and we've discussed. So both the risk analysis and the tender comparison. I would like now to conclude by highlighting 5 areas where we believe that targeted action can really make the biggest difference for Korea's offshore wind sector. So the first one is enhancing pre-development and tender preparation. One of the clearest lessons, I think, from international benchmark is that government-led site investigations, they really reduce the risk burden on developers and also increase the quality and competition in the tenders. When sort of developers don't have to absorb the full cost of early stage geotechnical service, mid-ocean campaigns, environmental baseline studies, they can bid with more confidence and also more realistic assumptions. The second recommendation is to clarify grid responsibilities and cost allocation. That is, as you heard also already, one of the most critical issues for Korea's market. You know, the key ask here is to have that anticipatory grid investment, grid development, rather than sort of the more reactive ones that we've seen in the years, and also the cost sharing rules. So who pays for what when it comes to offshore substations, export cables, grid reinforcements. All these need to be codified and made transparent because developers really cannot price a risk that they cannot see. Third, you have sort of the streamline and sequence of permitting. So that is basically the Offshore Wind Committee, which has been created under the Special Act. That should, of course, allow also some kind of flexibility and act as an empowered, again, one-stop shop, but at the same time, of course, also ensuring that there is some flexibility, maybe taking some examples here from the, for example, from the Danish model. Yes, sorry, I just missed it there. Yes, and then fourth, we have the strengthened community and stakeholder engagement. As we've seen, Korea's track record with fishing community opposition really makes this a non-negotiable. So when it comes to fisheries compensation, it's important to have both a robust but also more standardized framework. And beyond fisheries, that is really kind of cross communities. So that's really a need for structured dialogue platforms that brings together developers, local authorities, grid operators, community representatives on a regular basis, and not more as a kind of ad hoc exercise that only happens when conflicts arise. Here, Japan structured fisheries negotiation can actually be a good inspiration for Korea also to learn from. And then fifth would be the optimized tender design to attract investment. Three things matter most here: revenue stability, that is something you heard kind of across the whole offshore wind sector. Really not only, of course, CFD, a model like a bit the Korean one, which is the CFD-like fixed price PPA framework, but really a full transparent package with indexation, clear indexation and settlement rules to make also this model generally bankable. So secondly, of course, the recalibrating of the localization criteria. We're not saying the localization is wrong, but Korea's industrial policy are more than legitimate. But of course, what we've seen is also this weighting of domestic supply criteria in tender scoring that is creating a situation where private international developers who could bring knowledge, capital, execution capacity to the country are struggling to compete. And then finally, also would say the sort of realistic commissioning windows and proportional penalties. That is also a good lesson learned from the failed Danish tender. It's important if we want to be ambitious with our offshore wind targets also to have realistic penalty structures and flexible COD timelines, which are also proportionate. So that would be all for at least for our presentation. The main, I think the key message here is that Korea offshore wind sector has huge potential and the political commitment is there. Offshore Wind Special Act is really a great step in that direction. So what is needed now is the kind of the quick also and the more sort of accelerated implementation of these reforms. So thank you all for, of course, your attention today, and we will now open up for questions. So I will give the floor back to the embassy. Or to Michelle.
Can you hear and see me?
We have one question in the chat here. Oh, there's Emily. Go ahead.
So we would open the floor for questions. I think Michelle would be very kind to read the question in the chat. And then if anybody has other questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask the questions to the panel.
And if we don't see your hand, please just unmute yourself and speak up. I'll read the first question. There's one question in the chat here. Perhaps Valeria or Young can answer. It's from Eskild, and he asks, he says, we know from the Global Wind Energy Council that there's a significant competency gap in the industry. How is the skills gap influencing the risks we are seeing, particularly when it comes to decision-making and early stage risk governance? Any thoughts on that one?
You go ahead, Young. I think you had was it a hand up, or wasn't sure? Or otherwise, I can take that. I can take that maybe. But it's a great question, and I think it really, based on the risks that we have highlighted across the full life cycle, is a risk that is something that really impacts affects across also the different stages, because of course in the beginning having a competency gap from industry means also that all that sort of early mapping of risks that we discussed, or that it's so important to start as early as possible, that cannot maybe be fully done, because there are also some things that maybe are overseen by an industry which is still maturing, which is not fully aware of sort of what is coming, and then of course when we move into the tender phase and the whole competition and sort of who competes for what, then of course having these requirements, or at least having this scoring as we've seen, because they're not been strictly localization requirements for Korea, but more like a scoring for which has rewarded at least a localization, and that is something that of course affects also the final results, because we can see that yes, it can be that there are projects that are more focused on local supply that win the tender, but on the other hand, then when the project needs to be executed, as we've seen, I mean, there can be supply chain issues or technical issues, and again, if this is kind of a more immature supply chain that still depends on on imports, then this causes delays. And as we've seen, I mean, these delays in the execution phase, particularly, they are really costly. So this can be, again, really a problem for developers, and simply also means that these ambitions that we have, that Korea set, do not get met in time, at least. So there is a bit, again, I would say, a problem that goes across different phases. Morten, you have a hand up.
Yeah, I think I would like to comment on as well, because there's definitely competency in Korea, but there's naturally a lack of experience of development, and we have supported companies both as international developer-led, local developer-led, and consortium-based between national and international players. And I think there's a strong desire for all parties to move fast, especially on the, let's say, the Korean EPC style of fast development. And I think here's instead of saying competency, I think it's also make sure that we involve best practice from international projects, that there are some maybe unforeseen risks. So make sure we don't move too fast through a few critical projects, because that, as Valeria has stated, that will propagate risk into the later stages and then cause more harm. So I think competency for both design, manufacturing, installation, everything there is available in Korea, but there's maybe a gap on absorbing the international lessons learned in the best way. Yeah.
Very good, thank you. Oh, Young, you have something to add to that?
Right. I totally agree with Valeria and Morten's answer about this kind of things. Then we need to admit that the competence gap is always here, and also in Korea as well. I think not only for the technical challenge administration and addressed, we need to also thinking about the workforce training, so that we are going to have the many experienced personnel who are able to move all the project and move forward without any underdetermined issues or the underdetermined risk as well.
Thank you. We have another question from, I don't dare to pronounce this name because I'm sure I will kibosh it. We have another question. In terms of risk in supply chain, what do you see the major challenges and the current situation?
I think I can have a brief comment on it, Michelle.
Thank you.
And Young, of course, to jump in. From our side, of course, what we see the most is manufacturing capability is there, but there's also a shift in supply chain in terms of what products have usually been manufactured in large volume in Korea. So I think the general supply chain is there, but there's a specific supply chain adaptation needs to come. And then, of course, vessel production is strong, but it's very bespoke vessels that are used in this industry. And then how do you then take these very specific vessels and make sure that you have also the let's say revenue forecast for those, have them across something where installation can come on top of each other, so there'll be very high demand for certain vessels at a certain point, and how do you then bridge that over multiple projects? So I think for us it's of course a lot about the foundation manufacturing, cable manufacturing, and vessel supply chain from our side, but Young as well from your side.
Right. Almost of what I would like to tour was also covered by Morten. Then we have robust supply chain for manufacturing the foundation or cable and so on. But as Morten mentioned, that we have lack of supply chain for turbine and vessels as well. Then we would like to see a more robust supply chain for this matter. But at the moment so far is not clear, for the developers to see that how much localization requirements we should comply with or we should follow in terms of the getting successful in the coming auctions, and how we can implement such kind of localization plan. That's a key concern that many developers, not only for international but also for domestic developers, are having now.
Makes sense. Thank you. We have another question from Minsin Park. Korean government is trying to implement solar and wind profit sharing model by forming finance cooperatives to increase local acceptance. what could potential risks for the developer be caused by this?
Maybe I can take that. Well, I think also kind of looking at the Danish experience, for example, for this, that it's been quite used, and it's been quite used also mostly onshore. There are also some, of course, requirements for the offshore wind. Overall, I would say, when we talk about profit sharing and sort of community cooperatives, that's a smart tool for social to increase social acceptance. And I think overall the experiences are quite successful. Of course, maybe from a developer's perspective, purely at least from a developer's perspective, that adds also a complexity, that's a layer, of course, into that. So and also financial, sort of complexity that otherwise will not be there, basically. And requires, of course, also kind of some more standardized methodology, also kind of how to price, those revenues, and might end up being also in kind of protracted negotiations with the communities. So what is important is that it's not so much kind of ad hoc negotiations, because that can really be sort of case by case and sort of be very unstructured and cause huge delays. So that there is somehow, there is a framework for this that is robust and sort of it makes this kind of a way standardized in a way for everyone. Another thing is also that on the one hand, of course, financial sort of compensation is one thing, but it doesn't solve necessarily position alone. There needs to be some kind of also local participation. So there has to be something else besides that, so that is not again, it's not just about financial sort of the financial aspect of it, which is though very important, and I think it has shown to be also the sort of the key, of course. But I think a standardized framework is quite important here. Otherwise, it could even cause delays, and more issues for developers. I don't know if Morten or someone else want to add.
That's great. Thank you, Valeria. Do we have any other questions from our participants today? Since we're rounding the hour, so we're going to have to wrap it up. So if there's any more questions, please do speak up. Otherwise, we'll say thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate. Thank you, Valeria and Young, and thank you to the embassy, Korea's embassy. Oh, we have one more question. Should we take it real quickly? Eskild, you want to speak up? No question. He's clapping.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you to the embassy in Korea and to the Danish
Thank
Energy
you.
Association and to everybody presenting today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.